Hello and welcome back to part 5 of today's lecture series on ancient erotic art. And in this part of the lecture, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the female body and representations of heterosexual couplings as well. So let's go back to sort of the first overtly eroticized image of a female body on a monumentalized scale in Greek culture. This would be the Aphrodite of Cnidos that we've discussed before by the sculptor Praxiteles from about 350 BC. And as we've discussed before, this is mostly a review here. With these representations of the idealized female body, we see curvaceous figures. We see an attempt at a sort of modesty, almost a little bit like a burlesque style modesty, where you have competing reveals and attempts at covering the body to sort of heighten the erotic state of the statue. And then we have a sort of fleshy figure with not really detailed representation of female genitalia in these classical sculptures, more of a sort of schematic, hidden away kind of representation. So when we look at the goddess of love, Aphrodite, the sort of goddess of eroticism in this period, she is going to be our real template for what the ideal female body should look like in this period, right? So our beauty standards are very much what we see here in this Roman copy of that Aphrodite of Cnidos, and those last for a very long period of time. One thing that we also have move myself. One thing that we also have in earlier Greek representation on sort of daily life objects are nude women in both overtly erotic scenes and also in scenes in which they are in the company of other women, other young women. So these sorts of groups, like here we see an amphora showing a group of swimming and bathing women. So partaking in the sort of daily life activities that women would do as a social occasion among other women. A little bit of a reflection of the athletic activities that we see young men taking part of. To move into yet another aspect of the way that eroticism works with the representation of women, not all erotic representations of women involve nudity. So we have this common scene. This is an example in Black Figure, where the hero Achilles falls in love with the queen of the Amazon, these warrior women, so a heavily armored female here, at the moment that he is killing her in battle. So a tragic love that is represented not through nudity, but actually calling upon the iconography of war, emphasizing the conflict that arises oftentimes in erotic scenarios. And this is particularly uncomfortable often for our modern eyes, particularly in these days, to see how closely drawn the lines are between the scenes of war, of battle, of violent action, and the scenes of erotic action when things are represented as being out of control. So we'll see this frequently in mythological representations that are identified as rape scenes, that are snatching scenes where a man is carrying off a woman, usually presumably against her will, in order to make her his wife. So that connection between violence and sexuality is pretty prominent in classical imagery and is disturbing to our modern sensibilities. So that's a bit of a warning, although I think I've actually left most of those kinds of images out. Not the next one, though. The next one falls very closely into this category. So here we see back that same pediment from the temple of Zeus at Olympia, the west pediment with Apollo at the center, our early nude classical male. And surrounding him in this pediment, the story that is told is of the Lapiths and the centaurs and the battle that occurred between them. So this is a mythological story that dates to the Age of the Heroes, in which we see a group of humans called the Lapiths. These townspeople hold a wedding and invite a group of centaurs. So we see here these half horse, half man centaurs and human women. They invite them to a local wedding, and the centaurs become drunk. They get unruly, and they start to try and carry off and snatch up all of the women that are the Lapiths, including the bride herself. So what we see in this pediment structure is the battle ongoing between the Lapiths and the centaurs as they are snatching up women, and the women are trying to resist them. So you see here she's giving him an elbow to the head as he has sort of got one arm around her waist and one hand groping her, and she is trying to fight him off. And then over here we have another centaur who has a woman kind of in his hoof, so locked between the forelegs of his horse body, and she has both of her arms tearing at his beard and hair. So a really violent conflict being displayed here. And then the god Apollo at the center, who we looked at a little bit earlier, is stopping that chaos, bringing his sort of Apollonian promise of a more orderly planet, right, being the sun god, about those normalization of natural cycles and the sort of calendars of culture, right? So this idea of calm, normal, order, law, music, song, dance, pleasant things. Apollo is very much in that realm. So he is stopping this contest, stopping the battle, and restoring order to the situation here. But we see these images even very early on of women who are in distress, basically being snatched away in these kinds of violent compositions that are designed to show bad behavior on the part of the men, but are common enough that it seems to have been a sort of a cultural trope. A little bit later on, to come back to the ideas of how nudity is not the only way of showing eroticism. This is an example we briefly talked about before, the Nike of Samothrace, a Hellenistic sculpture. And she is fully clothed, right? So she has a dress covering her entire body in drapery, but the drapery is carved in such a style that it clings to every single curve of the body here, including showing off, her navel area. And it is in these very sort of tight, almost damp looking folds. So we see another way of showing sort of an erotic female figure, but one that is supposed to be iconographically modest, is to represent the drapery in such a style that it becomes quite revealing, and also, again, adheres to that idea of titillation that I discussed a bit earlier, where you want to see a little bit of clothing or an attempt kind of on the part of the woman to resist your gaze. We also get overtly erotic scenes. These show up earliest in the realm of sort of daily life objects. Here we have a kylix, and a series of couples who are in various different sexual positions, males and females engaged with one another. These are super common scenes for things like drinking cups, looking again into that idea of the transformation, the sexuality that is associated with becoming inebriated and adopting a different mindset. So these ideas that we think of as contemporary of the dangers of drinking and sex go all the way back to our ancient Greeks here and their culture of symposia. So here we see a scene from one of these symposia showing the hetairai, these female courtesans who were part of this male masculine drinking culture of the symposium, interacting with their sort of male counterparts on these drinking couches. So we have one who's playing that drinking game, Kotobos, where you threw the dregs at a target. These two are engaging with one another in an erotic embrace. And then over here, we have a third woman who is standing up and talking to a man who's reclining on the couch. So There are many, many depictions of symposiastic scenes like this one in the previous slide that emphasize interaction between men and women in a sexual context, in a drinking context. And it is generally understood that these are not the wives and the matrons and the elite society females of Greek society, but rather these courtesans who were of lower social status, but perhaps higher education levels, to be able to be part of these sort of elite intellectual drinking and dining evenings. Just one more example. And another example that shows, again, how they would be together on the couch. There's usually a lot of emphasis on in these paintings where they show up on the tondo of a kylix on sort of a surprise sexual scene. So perhaps as you're drinking the wine and draining the liquid down in this flat cup and the bottom scene is being revealed to you, first you see the tops of the heads, the flute, then it is revealed that we have these prominent, frontally aligned breasts here, and then you get down further and further as you continue to drink. So changing the level of inebriation, changing the effect of the image as the level of liquid differs as one goes through the drinking process here. Looking a little bit outside of the area of Greek pottery and looking at Pompeii, something really interesting that we see. I've talked a lot about how the ancient world is surprisingly, or maybe it's sad that it is surprising, but it tends not to have the reputation of being terribly multicultural, but it was. Here we have two statuettes of female goddess-like figures from Pompeii, so from our buried city in Italy. The one on the left is the statuette of Venus in a gilded bikini style outfit. She looks a little bit like Princess Leia to me. And then on the right, we have an ivory statue that shows an Indian-style figure, perhaps from the Greco-Indian areas like Bactria in the east, that has been identified either as Lakshmi or a Yakshi, so a sort of wood nymph, either way a figure associated with sort of beauty and fertility. So this shows really long-term trade and the potential for exoticism of the female figure as well, right? So an appreciation for different ways of showing off what makes a woman particularly attractive. I think one thing that's really interesting to notice about these two figures is that, as I mentioned before, in classical statues, there's sort of an emphasis on a hidden pudenda for females. With our Lakshmi Yakshi figure here, we have a real emphasis on sort of showing a full and really a larger genital area for our female figure. Venus herself is, again, like our first slide here, everywhere. There are a billion forms of Venus statues, so I just wanted to introduce you to a couple, give you a little bit of vocabulary to work with. On the left, we have the Anadyomene type, rising right after Venus is said to have been born from the sea. She wrings out her hair. And then on the right, we have the Callipyge type, which is the beautiful buttocks type, where she is actually holding up her garment behind her and revealing a very round Kardashian-esque derriere to the viewer. So another one of those statues that, kind of like our sleeping hermaphrodite, relies on the surprise of moving around the statue in space. Here are three versions of the crouching Aphrodite type that we've looked at briefly before. One from the Louvre, one from the Vatican, and one from the National Museums in Rome. This is one of the most common types of Venus, and here I love this sort of emphasis on her feminine roles that show up in this crouching position. So crossing the sensuality of a fully nude female without any of that garmentry around her, with the position where she is sort of hiding herself from the viewer actively, and a little bit implicating you in that voyeuristic gaze. Making it twice now into the last 30 seconds of our class is the matron Venus type, where we see elite Roman women commissioning statues of themselves with portrait faces, showing their fancy hairstyles, and then attaching that head to the body of a Venus, so appropriating the goddess of love and her sensuality, while not giving up any of your sort of elite status and ability to your matronly status. So not exactly erotic, but very youthful and beautiful. In 6 seconds, to do, write an art historical description about your image. Enjoy.